and baking a new bread that had no leaven in it to symbolize that they were not taking anything with them from their former life in Egypt. Leaven was taken, off of a loaf. When a loaf was baked, before the baking of the loaf, a piece was taken off and it was allowed to ferment and it became the starter for the next loaf. It symbolized influence, as I told you last time. And the unleavened bread was a way of saying we're starting new. There's no influence of the old life. So it was symbolic of new life. It was symbolic of cutting apart from Egypt, of separating from worldliness. But now it's something different. Now unleavened bread doesn't talk anymore of that which is not influenced by the evil of the world. Unleavened bread now means my body, he says. And he is transforming the Passover. Now that takes a lot of authority, folks. You're fooling with something that God ordained. But Jesus is God in human flesh, and he can rewrite the script. And having ended the old economy, he now initiates the new. And says, I want you to take and eat this bread as representative of my body. And Luke 22:19 adds, which is given for you, this do in remembrance of me. And that's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11:24. So he takes the bread and it becomes emblematic of his body, a symbol and a picture. Now Christ is saying, I give my body to die in death for you. That's what he's saying. My body, as this bread is broken and consumed, my body will be given. And I want you to do this in remembrance of me. Then in verse 28 he says, regarding the cup, this is my blood of the covenant. This is my blood of the covenant. Matthew and Mark just say the covenant. Luke again and Paul say the new covenant. And somehow the word new got into the authorized of Matthew. But what he is saying is, this is my blood of the covenant. It is the new covenant. The new covenant written in his blood. If you go back to Exodus 24 and verse 8, you will find that that's basically a quote of Exodus 24:8. And what Jesus is saying is that God, when he made a covenant with man, required what? Blood. When God made a covenant with Abraham, there was blood shed by animals. When God made a covenant with Moses, there was blood shed. When God made a covenant with Noah, there was a sacrifice laid on an altar. God required blood shed in making covenants with men. When God brought reconciliation with himself, the price was blood. That men might know that a relationship to God was going to cost the blood of a sacrifice. And all of that pointed to Christ, who would be that sacrifice. And when the priest stood knee-deep in the blood of thousands upon thousands upon thousands of lambs, it was a way of reminding them all of the cost of God's reconciliation to man. That it cost bloodshed, sacrifice. That's why Hebrews 9:22 says, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sin. A covenant with God always demanded not just death, not just hitting an animal on the head so that it died, but blood shedding, because the life of the flesh is in the blood, it says in Leviticus. And the pouring out of the blood was a very graphic, a very painful, a very vivid demonstration of the loss of life. And so Jesus died to save us from our sin, but it wouldn't be just enough for him to die. He had to die and in his death pour out blood through the wounds in his hands, the wounds in his feet, the wound in his side, the thorn marks in his head, blood running everywhere to demonstrate that the life was flowing out of him graphically and visibly, that he was offering himself as a blood-shedding sacrifice for sin. And so Jesus says, when you take this cup, it is not anymore to remind you of the blood of the lamb in Egypt, blood put on the doorposts and the lintel. It is not anymore to remind you of that. It is to remind you from now on of my blood, which is shed. That word shed is the key to the whole understanding of the verse. It is shed blood. This is my blood of the covenant, the blood being shed, the Greek says. It had to be shed blood, the graphic, demonstrable way of seeing the life poured out. Now, obviously, We were saved through His death. There was nothing in the chemistry of His blood to save us. We were saved in His dying, but He had to pour out that blood because God had required a blood-letting, a blood-shedding sacrifice so that there would be vividness and so that it could be seen that the life was poured out. And so Jesus says, this cup will remind you of my blood shed. Notice, for many, literally for the benefit of many. For the benefit of many. And who are the many? All who believe, Jew and Gentile. Not just the blood shed like in the old covenant for the nation of Israel, but the blood of Jew and Gentile, the many, beyond just Israel, to all, for the forgiveness of sins. In other words, His blood was shed to bring forgiveness of sins. The sacrificial, bloodletting, substitutionary death to bring about forgiveness. That's why Jesus came. And He instituted the memorial to that the night before His death. So our Lord headed for the cross to pour out His blood as a sacrifice for sin. And He instituted the bread and the cup as a memorial for all time, that we might remember the self-sacrificing, blood-spilling death of Christ for us. The old covenant had all those animals, none of which could take away sin. The blood of Christ alone could do it. And so the feast that we celebrate is here at this table with the bread and the cup. Finally, the duration. How long do we do this? Passover ended that night. There's never been an authorized Passover since. A lot of Jewish people still doing it. Might be a nice custom, but it's a dead feast. It has no purpose. It ignores the true feast of redemption. So if that ended then, how long do we do this? Well, verse 29 says, I say to you, I will not drink henceforth of the fruit of the vine. That's just a colloquialism for the wine. Until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. What He is saying is, keep doing it until I do it with you in the kingdom. When Jesus comes in His second coming and sets up the kingdom, that great event that He was talking about in Matthew 24 and 25 was going to come. He was telling them here He was going to die. He was telling them about pouring out His blood. This is a pretty tragic thing to hear, and so He injects this thought that I'm going to come back and I'm going to do this with you in my kingdom. Don't worry, I'll be back. And there's a reaffirmation in verse 29 of His kingdom promise. I'll do it with you in my kingdom. And I believe when Jesus comes and we enter into His kingdom, we're going to do this with Him. We're going to celebrate this with Him. We're going to remember His sacrifice together. And I'm not sure that we won't do that forever and ever and ever throughout all eternity. In some marvelous way that He has designed. For it's an unforgettable and